Okay, so it's just me then. Good to know. Then I'm just going to press along unless I see somebody erupt in the comments. The stream isn't working, the stream isn't working. So even though the cover of this Noble Collection catalog says Harry Potter, most of this is Hobbit and Lord of the Rings stuff. And it all looks amazing. I don't know if you can see all this stuff here. I bought one thing from them many years ago, and they send me a catalog every year, and it drives me crazy. I have to stop looking at it. So, what are we talking about today? We are talking about, as we will be doing through the entire month, NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month. And with National Novel Writing Month this week, we're going to be talking about influential writers, people who have really sort of set the trends with what's popular in science fiction and fantasy. And if you have any favorites or any authors who particularly inspired you, then please feel free to say something in the chat, and we'll go from there. I have a whole list. I have a huge list of writers, and we'll try to make our way through them all. But before we get to that, I would like to go over just a couple quick things, some housekeeping stuff, if you will. As a reminder, we have our Rewrite Tolkien contest going on this month, and the theme for this month is J.K. Rowling. And what that means is you can pick any character or situation from The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. You can even do some crossovers with Harry Potter and try to do it in the more lighthearted style of J.K. Rowling, or however you feel best expresses it. We love variety, so please be as creative as possible. As always, the rules are it must be 500 to 2,000 words. It must, I can barely read this now. Oh yes. You must submit your entry in the body of the email to Rewrite Tolkien Contest at TheOneRing.net. We won't be opening any attachments. And be sure to tell us your full name and your location, so if you win, we can credit you appropriately. And also, there's only one submission per contestant. And you can't post your entry in any torn message board or on our Facebook page. Leave it only for us, the judges, and we will we'll look it over and make our decisions. And honestly, we love getting these entries to this contest. There's a huge level of creativity among the fans, and it's genuinely a joy to read these things. So if you have any sort of inkling to write something for this contest, please do so. We would love to hear from you. And also, as a reminder, our book of the month is Darkling by K.M. Rice, who you might know better as Keely, one of the two hosts of Happy Hobbit. This is her debut novel. It's available in ebook form, but this past weekend it also is now available in print form. And after the show, I will be posting a link on our Facebook page to that site, so you can order it if you want to. So, now that we have all that out of the way, I want to talk to you a little bit about a new book that just came out that is quite relevant to our discussion, or our theme, I should say. And while we're doing that, I want to give a special shout out to one of our more unsung heroes at Torn. We have lots of unsung heroes at TheOneRing, but particularly Demosthenes, who works night and day, tirelessly posting up um, the main bulk of all the articles that you see. He edits them, he tweaks them, he writes tons of stuff on his own. He is always on it, and he's always giving us great stuff. And he got us this, uh, a preview of a new book called Middle Earth Envisioned by Brian J. Robb and Paul Simpson. Oh, I stole the One Ring. You're not a baddie for not rereading the book. The fact that you've already read it is good. um, so this book is a collection of various illustrations of Tolkien's world of Middle Earth throughout the years, going all the way back to the early illustrations of The Hobbit, and um, and going all the way up to the current Hobbit movies. And there's so many wonderful things to choose from, and this book in particular has some really wonderful selections, and I put together a little slideshow that I want to show you some of the things that are in this book. The most interesting of which is a collection of illustrations that, until this day, have not been um, published, and they were done by a school teacher named Mary Fairburn in 1968. And what makes these illustrations unique is that these are one of the few that Tolkien himself actually commented on. He said, they are better pictures in themselves and also show far more attention to the text than any that have been yet submitted to me. So that is high praise from Tolkien. And we have a few of these illustrations to show you, and I have to say they are quite fascinating. Let me just bring the chat back up here real quick. So these are 4 illustrations by Mary Fairburn. So here's the first one, and this is of Lothlorien. Now what I like about these illustrations is that the style is very Renaissance, and this picture of Lothlorien is very ethereal. I really like this one. The next one we have is the Old Forest, which, as we all know, never quite got onto the screen in the Lord of the Rings movies. But here's a nice picture of Frodo and company entering the Old Forest, and they're about to have their wonderful side adventures with the Barrow-wights and Tom Bombadil and all that fun stuff. And then there's this one, which is of Gandalf being rescued from the Tower of Orthanc. And this is a very stark one, but I really like it. I think this is a really cool illustration. And then the last one here is Sam pursuing the orcs, who have just kidnapped Frodo after he was attacked by Shelob. And the thing I really like about this illustration is that Sam is on the far right, and he has this ghost looming over him. And that's the spirit of the One Ring, which he is now the bearer of, because he took it off of Frodo when he was put under by Shelob. So that is a really interesting and unique depiction of the influence of the ring, which I don't think I personally have never seen before. And I thought that was just a really cool thing. Kelly is not talking about her book today. She's going to be on either next week or the week after, and we will be discussing the book. As of now, read it. So those were some illustrations from from Mary Fairburn. And there's also some really interesting collections from other sources. An interesting one in this book is from one of the very early illustrations of The Hobbit that was done in serialized format on in a magazine called Girl, which at the time changed its name to Princess. It was a young girls magazine. So what's going on here? Okay. Oh, it's Temple. Okay. Um, all right, I'll give you some time to figure out your name, but um, yeah, we need. I'm gonna keep pressing forward because we got a lot of stuff to cover. Oh, you're not a mess, Temple. There. Yes, I stole the One Ring. She knows what to do. So, so I wanted to show you also a couple illustrations from this serialized version of The Hobbit, and this was done in 1965, I want to say. And there you are, Temple! Yay! Um, so yeah, this is the first of an illustration of The Hobbit from 1965 that was done in serialized form in a young girls magazine. And there we have Bilbo in the Shire. Look at that hair. And that pipe is ridiculous. But it is a very, it's a very interesting picture of Bilbo. It's quite cartoony. And, oh, the chat disappeared again. Where'd it go? There you are. So yeah, just drink that image of Bilbo in for a little bit, why don't you? It's kind of weird. But it's a very sort of 1965 picture. So there's also another illustration from that same series of the famous Riddles in the Dark scene. And one of Tolkien's notes on this to the publisher was, "Do not make Gollum look like a monster." And I think they pulled it off. I don't know, you tell me. Gollum looks like a crazy monkey. And also, yeah, he's not a very threatening creature in this picture, but it's still pretty funny to look at. And Ustreamer 312372, or is that 322? I can't tell. You're publishing your book soon from Amazon. Please tell us more about it or post it on our Facebook page. I'd love to hear more about it from you. So going forward again, there's some more interesting things in this book. One last bit of imagery I'm going to show you from it is some excerpts from the Hobbit graphic novel, which was published a few decades ago, and is it's actually a very beautiful piece of work. And if you you can probably find a copy in just about any bookstore or any comic book shop. There's usually one copy of it, the Hobbit graphic novel. And here are a couple images from that. This is, of course, Gandalf arriving at the Shire. And this is it's a very lovely look at this thing, wouldn't you say? I love this version of the Shire. I mean, I love every version of the Shire, but uh, there's this is a very nice idyllic look at it, which I've only seen one other time, and that was in Peter Jackson's movies. And then again, we have Riddles in the Dark. And this one, it, it looks more cartoony, and Gollum, as you can see, is a bit more creature-like. Um, but also, it captures the more subtle and calm nature of this scene as opposed to what we saw in that previous illustration of Gollum just chasing Bilbo. Um, and I like this because like you can sort of feel the intensity. You can see it in Bilbo's face even though he's trying to hide it. This is a very well done graphic novel, and I would highly recommend picking it up if you can find it. And so all of these are available in this book, Middle Earth Envisioned by Brian J. Robb and Paul Simpson. Um, and I would suggest checking it out. It is expensive. It's $40, but it's a very nice looking book, I have to say. And I'll be posting a link to this book where you can purchase it on the Facebook page after we're done here. So now that we have finished with that, we're going to get into the big discussion. And the big discussion is influential writers. And it took me a long time to compile a good list of influential writers. I took to Facebook and asked people who they considered to be the biggest influence or the biggest inspiration to them. And I got a huge variety of, pardon me, need my coffee. I got a huge variety of responses, and there were a few that were repeated over and over again. And I was also taking into account the writers who have inspired me over the years, and I'm sure you will know many, if not all, of the people on this list. One thing that I did notice as I was compiling this list is that it was pretty much almost entirely men. And I felt like this is not cool because there are so many great women writers out there. I mean, our book of the month, Darkling, written by a woman, one of the biggest movie franchises of all time. Oh yes, yes they are. I picked these books specifically. um, one of the biggest book and movie franchises of all time was written by a woman, Harry Potter. Um, well, I Stole the One Ring. Who got the most mentions? I'm going to get into that right now, and we're going to go through them one by one. So we will start, of course, with the man himself, J.R.R. Tolkien. Yes, Ursula K. Le Guin is a great choice, too. So, Tolkien, of course. What can we say about J.R.R. Tolkien other than he is the reason we're all here? And Jack London is a great choice. I wanted to try to keep this to sci-fi and fantasy, but you are absolutely right, Ustreamer31. Jack London is a fantastic author, and his books are wonderful. So but getting back on topic, let's talk a little bit about J.R.R. Tolkien, because he's the reason we're all here. He's the reason these movies exist. He's the reason this community exists. He's the reason this awesome set of books here I have exists. This is actually the first edition of Lord of the Rings that was published with appendices and a pull-out map of Middle Earth. It would probably fetch a very tidy sum on eBay, but I will never sell it because it was a gift from my father, and it's Lord of the Rings. Come on. So, so what is it about Tolkien and his works that makes him so influential? And for me, what it comes down to is just his level of world creation. Like, for me, when I first read Lord of the Rings, it really kind of expanded my mind into the potential of what you can create in a fictional world. Because Middle Earth is an incredibly dense and vivid world, and to see it on the pages like that is just incredible. And yes, I see we're talking about female authors, and this is all very important because next week I want to do an episode focusing on female writers, because I feel like they kind of got the short end of the stick this time around, and that is not fair and not right, because there are tremendously talented female writers out there. And so next week we'll be dedicating an episode to female writers. I agree, Temple. His stories don't really have a traditional beginning, middle, and end, but they're very readable. And for me, what makes them so readable is just the level of detail in these stories. I had never before that point read anything that quite had this level of detail in its descriptions, and created this world that I could see fully formed in my mind. And for me, that's what makes Tolkien such a tremendous influence. And we really can't talk about Tolkien without talking about, where is he? Where is he? There he is. C.S. Lewis, who, of course, did the Narnia books, among other things. Ustreamer31, your book. If you could email me some information on your book, I'd love to check it out. Let me just put my email in the chat real quick so that you have it. There. Yes, so please send me some information about that, your book. What is it? The Viking Lord? I'd love to learn more about it. And yes, Narnia is childhood. And beyond that, I mean, Narnia is just one of those series that really kind of draws you in with. It's got this sense of childlike wonder to it because it's told from the perspective of children. But at least the main bulk of it is. But one of the things about C.S. Lewis also is that he liked to write religious parables. And there is some of that in Narnia, but he does it in a very subtle way. And he doesn't do it in a preachy way. He does it more as as an exploration of religion, particularly through the character of Aslan, who is he's an avatar for just about any kind of religious icon you can think of. And that's what I think. That's what I personally like about Narnia so much, is that it's imaginative, it's fun, it's lighthearted, and yet has some very interesting themes going through it the entire time. And the way I describe it is that it talks to children, it doesn't talk down to them. And that's why I think something like the Chronicles of Narnia endures as much as it does today. So, who do we have next on the list? Oh, I'm sorry, Ustreamer31. My email didn't turn up on the chat. Well, I'm going to be putting it up on the screen at the end of the show, so please stick around at the end and jot it down, because I would love to learn more about your book. So, who do we have next on the list here? Well, I tried to focus on sci-fi and fantasy authors, and so let's go with a more modern fantasy author, and that is Neil Gaiman, who really just kind of blows my mind with just about everything he writes. He has a very unique way with words. And I have here probably one of my favorite Neil Gaiman books, American Gods, which, if you've never read, I highly recommend it. It's a sort of a religious story, but in a very unique way, because it's basically about all the ancient gods who used to be worshipped and adored throughout the years and the ages, but have since sort of been sort of disappeared, and they've come to Earth and they're trying to live their lives. And it's a very bizarre, surreal story, but so incredibly imaginative. And I will have to say that my all-time favorite Neil Gaiman book, yes, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is very good. I will get to that. But I was saying my all-time favorite Neil Gaiman book has to be The Graveyard Book, which is a retelling of Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, only instead of the child being raised in the jungle by animals, he is raised in a graveyard by ghosts. It's such a bizarre story, and yet it's so endearing. I found myself crying towards the end of it when he realizes that he can't be a ghost like everybody else because he's still alive. It's really just a beautiful story, and for a theme like that, you would think it would be very dark and very grim, but it's not. It's actually very uplifting. And I think that's a true testament to Neil Gaiman's style and to his imagination, is that nothing is quite as it seems when you read something by Neil Gaiman. And that's why I think he's so influential. So, moving on from Neil Gaiman, we'll stick with somebody who's still more modern and has just been mentioned, and that is, and we'll also start moving into more of the sci-fi realm. Let's talk a little bit about Douglas Adams, who, again, just what's so great about Douglas Adams is, of course, his sense of humor, and I have here The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This is the entire 5-part trilogy, which that alone should tell you just what a weird guy Douglas Adams is. Um, there are 5 books in the Hitchhiker's Guide series. There's The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, Life, the Universe, and Everything, So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, and Mostly Harmless. And Douglas Adams, he used to write for, I believe he used to work with Monty Python, at least in some way. If I'm mistaken, I'm sure you'll tell me. Oh no, the stream isn't loading for you? Uh-oh. Yeah, I've been having some trouble with the stream too. Hopefully, just reloading it will help. But anyway, I can't talk into the void. So, what I love about Douglas Adams and Hitchhiker's Guide is just how absurd it is. Like, it's very bizarre, and yet in its own weird way, it all makes sense. For instance, there's one point where one of the characters says, "Flying is easy. Just fall and miss the ground." It's such a weird line, and yet that logic is infallible. And there's no real good way to describe the plot of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's sort of just one misadventure after another. And of course, Hitchhiker's Guide is not the only thing Douglas Adams has ever done. He also has the Dirk Gently series, which I believe is only 2 books. Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency and The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul. Both are really good stories, and I highly recommend them if you can get them. Yay! Yay, Eris, you're on! Okay. So that's Douglas Adams. And yes, as I'm going through these authors, please feel free to call out any books of theirs that particularly spoke to you, or that's funny, Temple. Your house number is 42. I love the whole thing with the number 42, and I of course have lots of really geeky, nerdy friends, and so whenever the number 42 appears randomly in our lives, we immediately just start giggling. For those of you who may not have read Hitchhiker's Guide and don't know what the reference to 42 is, it has to do with a race of aliens who build a computer that is designed specifically to discover the answer to life, the universe, and everything. This is its only purpose. It's this humongous computer called Deep Thought, and they ask it, "What is the answer to life, the universe, and everything?" And it says, I have to think about that. Come back in 10,000 years, or something like that. It's some ridiculously long amount of time. And so thousands of years later, they developed this whole religion around the computer, Deep Thought, and the day finally comes when it's going to reveal the answer to life, the universe, and everything, and the answer is 42. What does 42 mean? That is the answer to life, the universe, and everything, and Deep Thought says yes, but you didn't tell me what the question was. And they're like, but it's life, the universe, everything. That's not a question. And so they have to build another computer to ask the question, that has the answer for you too, and I won't spoil the ending for you. George R. R. Martin is another great influence. Yes, uh, he unfortunately didn't make the list just because there were so many on there. So, yes, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I highly recommend it. Do read it. It will change your life. School for Good and Evil by Soman Chinani. I've never heard of that. I might have to check that out. Thanks, Temple. So now that we've successfully transitioned from fantasy to sci-fi, we're going to stick with that for a little bit. And you can't talk sci-fi without talking about Isaac Asimov, who, I'll be honest with you, I didn't start reading him until fairly recently, maybe only a year ago, when I finally dove into, here we have it here, the Foundation series. And all I can say is that this is a thoroughly mind-blowing story. Um, it was written in the 50s, and there are many aspects of it that are of its time that may feel a little weird and somewhat antiquated today. The way people speak, the way certain characters are portrayed, feels like it's of an earlier era, even though it's taking place 10,000 years in the future. But it's a really good series about how best to describe what Foundation is about, because Foundation was actually given the only Hugo Award ever for best sci-fi series of all time. Uh, and that's high praise. It's the only time they have ever given that award out, and it was for this series, for Foundation. And so the best way to describe it is it sort of began as a sci-fi version of the fall of the Roman Empire. Um, and you can actually see certain terminology in this that was later used in stuff like Star Wars. For instance, the Empire in this is called the Galactic Empire, which is what it's called in Star Wars. Only in this one, the Empire isn't evil, it's just everywhere. It's the entire galaxy. And it focuses on this one character named Harry Seldon, who, let me see if I can remember the name of his realm of study. It's psychomathematics or something like that. Basically what it is he has created a mathematical algorithm that can, in essence, predict the future. But not specific future, just very wide-ranging future, the future of society as a whole. And what he's discovered is that the empire is on the decline. And not only is it on the decline, it's going to be gone in 500 years' time. And in the wake of that will be 30,000 years of Dark Age chaos throughout the galaxy. And so he proposes a plan not to save the Empire, but to reduce the time of this chaotic Dark Age from 30,000 years to 1,000 years and rebuild a new empire out of the ashes from that. And the way he does that is by creating this thing called the Encyclopedia Galactica, which is the repository of all human knowledge in the galaxy, which will be held in this one area called the Foundation. Or, well, it's the Encyclopedia Galactica Foundation, which is located on a distant outer rim world. But eventually they just call themselves the Foundation. And what you sort of unveil over time is that there's a lot more to Seldon's plan than just storing knowledge. Um, he's created various checkpoints throughout the next 500 years, long after he's died, um, that sort of keep everybody on track to keep this plan in motion. And it's all done through this really intense math that he developed. And it eventually ties back into his robot series, which is another amazingly influential series that Asimov wrote, which began with the short stories of I, Robot and went into the books The Caves of Steel and The Naked Sun and a couple others. I've read I, Robot and The Caves of Steel, and I'm reading The Naked Sun right now. And of course, the big thing that he created was the 3 laws of robotics, which go as follows. Rule number 1. A robot cannot harm or by inaction allow a human being to be harmed. Yes, Ustreamer31. Yes, please either post it to either post a link to your book trailer on the Facebook page or email it to me and I'll post it to the Facebook page. Yes, do that. So the laws of robotics. The first one, a robot cannot harm a human or through inaction allow a human to be harmed. Rule number 2, a robot must obey all commands from a human as long as it does not interfere with rule number 1. And rule number 3, a robot must preserve itself at all times as long as it doesn't come into conflict with rules 2 or rule number 1. Okay, sounds good, Ustreamer31. Yes, email it to me. I'll tell you now, I'm Saruman with 2 N's at TheOneRing.net. But I'm going to post that up at the end of the show as well, so you'll see it then too. And so what Asimov did with these 3 rules of robotics is he created this framework for some really interesting philosophical discussions that really even resonate today, especially now with robotics going as far as it has today. And even the people who, even the people in the stories are sort of dealing with issues that we're having to address today with robotics. And he was writing all of this back in the 50s. So that's why I recommend Isaac Asimov and why he was such a big influence on me. Because he's really helped me to sort of understand some deeper meanings behind the stuff that I write and expand all of that. And so moving on from Asimov, but staying in sci-fi, we're going to talk about Ray Bradbury. And Ray Bradbury, I have good fond memories of Ray Bradbury because I actually had the privilege of meeting him a few times before he passed away. And as they say, you know how they say never meet your heroes? That is not the case with Ray Bradbury. He was a very warm person, a very kind person. He loved talking to people. He loved engaging in conversation with people, especially on the deeper subjects. He loved to talk sci-fi with people, even if it wasn't about his stuff. Um, and he was so into it. And so many of his stories, so many of his books, like still resonate today. Um, like Fahrenheit 451, which I actually read in high school and might have been the first Ray Bradbury book I ever read. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat now. um, and Fahrenheit 451 was actually kind of a scary story for me because I was a very avid reader. Still am, of course. I've got a book show now. Um, um, yeah, what what scared me so much about Fahrenheit 451 was the idea that knowledge was dangerous and therefore all books need to be burned. And even to like an impressionable 13-year-old kid, like that terrified me. That whole idea scared the hell out of me. And it stuck with me for a very long time. And of course, there are so many other wonderful books that Ray Bradbury wrote. The Martian Chronicles, Dandelion Wine, uh, and one particular one that still holds a deep place in my heart, and that's kind of a lesser known book of his called Something Wicked This Way Comes. And it's not a sci-fi book. It's actually a period piece, and it's sort of a fantasy horror um, about a traveling carnival that comes to a sleepy Midwest town and starts to grant the wishes of everybody in the town in exchange for taking their souls. And and that one stuck with me mostly because Disney made a movie of it back in the early 80s. So I saw it when I was a kid. And it was a very creepy movie, and yet also uh, a very engaging movie. It really sort of dragged you in visually and thematically, and the book is just as good as the movie. And it's one of those rare instances where the book and the film adaptation of it are actually kind of on the same level with each other as far um, as far as enjoying it, as far as getting the themes across, the characters, the situations. Um, I would highly recommend checking that one out, either the book or the movie. Um, the Toynbee Collector is another great one, um, and of course his other short story. He wrote lots of short stories, but another one that was very influential was A Sound of Thunder, um, which was recently made into a very, very terrible movie. Don't go to see it; it will hurt your brain. Instead, read the story, because that was one of those stories that kind of blew my mind with time travel. Because um, with all the different themes you could have in science fiction, time travel is my own personal favorite. Just because of all the weird possibilities that could happen. And A Sound of Thunder really hit that home for me because what it's about is way off in the distant future, they have discovered time travel. They know how to do it. And so what they do is they take people on tourist excursions back to prehistoric times to see dinosaurs and even to hunt dinosaurs, but they do it very, very specifically. You have to stay on a very specific path. You cannot deviate from it. You can only shoot very specific dinosaurs that are about to die anyway. Um, and this is all because you don't want to mess with the environment, because the ripple effect of what could change in the future from doing that is incalculable. And the whole crux of the story is uh, this one man he goes on the trip, um, and then he goes back to his time, and everything has changed. Everything is chaotic. Nothing is as he remembers it. The world is completely turned around, messed up, upside down, and they can't figure out what happened. And then he looks down at his shoe and realizes that he had stepped on a butterfly back in prehistoric times, and that caused all of this. And that kind of blew my mind when I first read it. The idea that something so utterly inconsequential millions of years ago can have drastic effects millions of years later. And it sort of creates like this whole idea of like the destructive potential of time travel, which I still find fascinating and always try to work into whatever I write. So I've rambled on about Bradbury long enough. He's a personal hero of mine. I love them. I love the man, and I was so pleased that I was able to meet him and chat with him uh, before he passed. So, in the sci-fi vein, we're going to veer a little bit more towards horror now with another one who I found highly influential, H.P. Lovecraft. And Lovecraft is an interesting character. He was an interesting person because he was a recluse. He was very afraid of the outside world. He was very xenophobic. And a lot of that came through in his stories, but what he's best known for is a series of stories that is commonly known as the Cthulhu mythos. And if you are not familiar with Cthulhu or have not heard of it in any way, why is the chat not working? It's been like this for a while now. Anyway, I'm just waiting for the chat to explode with 1,000 things. So with the Cthulhu mythos, it's one of those rare stories that talks about something bigger than us, something greater. Ustreamer31, the show is supposed to go till about 4. We might run a little bit over, but, you know, so be it. What's interesting about Cthulhu is that it deals with these elder gods, these old creatures who were here long before mankind, and they are irredeemable. They're unapologetically evil. They don't care about us. They never did. They never will. And they're sleeping. And one day they're going to come back and wreak havoc on the world. And there's nothing anybody can do to stop it. And there's this strange sense of hopelessness in those stories because just about every one of the stories ends with the protagonist going insane. But it's also very fascinating, particularly with his later story, At the Mountains of Madness. Uh-oh. Chat is lagging. Yeah, okay. Okay, I'll just press forward because I'm starting to ramble now. So did did we break the chat? What did we do? Am I running too long? Uh-oh. Okay, well then I'm just going to press forward. H.P. Lovecraft, the Cthulhu mythos is a crazy, crazy series of stories. Also very ahead of its time, and I highly recommend checking some of them out, particularly stories like The Call of Cthulhu or At the Mountains of Madness. Uh, and so that brings us to somebody who wasn't really a contemporary of his, but is considered a contemporary of his, and that is Edgar Allan Poe. And I mean, what can you say about Poe? He was a very dark writer. Um, very few of his stories had any sort of hope in them. They were very dreary, very gloomy, and yet oddly poetic. And I mean, you talk to just about anybody who has ever been a goth in their life, and they will cite Edgar Allan Poe as their greatest influence. And he is a very influential writer. He influenced H.P. Lovecraft in many ways, and in fact, to the point where he even references Poe's stories in his own. And it's hard to really pin down what I like so much about Poe, except to say that he is a true masterful wordsmith. And maybe that's what I love about his work so much, because, I mean, me personally, I'm a very happy, positive guy. I don't really go in for a lot of dark, dreary stuff, and yet there's something that is unceasingly fascinating about Edgar Allan Poe. And I think it really is his use of language, his use of tempo and meter in his poems, um, to the point where some of his stories, some of his poems, you can almost feel the tension as you're reading it. I know that whenever I read a Poe story out loud, I always end up becoming frantic as I get further and further into it. and it's hard to not say that Poe is an influential writer, because he very much is. Everybody, I know very few people who have never read The Telltale Heart or The Raven and integrated it into their work in some way. So we've got one more now that we've transitioned from fantasy to sci-fi to horror. And we're going to end with this one, who was a personal big influence of mine. May not be for everybody else, but he was for me, back in when I was in high school, and that is Stephen King. And the first, oh no, commercials. The first Stephen King book I ever read was Misery, and it terrified me. There were scenes in that book, and these are scenes that never actually made it into the movie, um, that just really oozed with just this visceral fear on the part of Paul Sheldon. For those of you who don't know the plot of the story, Misery is about a novelist named Paul Sheldon, who for years has been writing a series of trashy romance books about a character named Misery. and he's finally written the final book in the series. He's killed off the character. He's ready to move on with his life and actually write some meaningful work for once in his life. And he goes out to a cabin in the woods to write his new novel, and he finishes it, and he's so happy. And as he's driving home, he gets caught in a blizzard and crashes. And he is picked up by this woman named Annie Wilkes, who nurses him back to health in her house. And it becomes pretty apparent pretty early on that she is an insane fan of his and quite psychotic and with a history. And he is now trapped. His legs are broken. He has no communication with the outside. He's in the middle of nowhere. It's impossible to get away from her, and he is at her mercy. And she knows it. And so she forces him to write a sequel to the Misery series that brings the character back to life. And if he doesn't, she will torture him and she will kill him. And it is a truly terrifying story. And for me, what got me with Stephen King so much was he has this very casual narrative voice that sort of feels like you're reading a one-sided conversation, kind of like listening to a guy talking on a web show. And there's a very how do I put this? It's very engaging. I mean, most of his stories take place in small towns, usually in Maine or in Colorado. It's very provincial. A lot of his characters tend to be the same no matter what. There are certain Stephen King tropes. You have there's usually an abusive alcoholic character in there somewhere. There's usually a religious nutcase in there somewhere. There's usually somebody who is almost naively good-hearted. And also a personal story of mine. When I was in high school, I was reading. I wanted to get into film and video production, and that's eventually what I went to school and got my degree in. But in high school, it was just me and my friends with a camera, and we had this very how do I put this? We had a very ambitious project, and it was all my idea to do a book-accurate remake of Stephen King's It. And this was shortly after It, the miniseries, had premiered and terrified an entire generation with Pennywise the Clown, who, in retrospect, is not really all that scary now, but he was then. He was for us when we were kids watching it. That project never got off the ground, but I always hoped to one day work with Stephen King or work on something that Stephen King did, and recently I did. As I have said before, I work in DVD and Blu-ray production, and a few months ago I got to work on the Blu-ray and the DVD for Under the Dome, the new series based on Stephen King's book. So it's nice that that has sort of all come full circle at this point. I've now officially worked on a Stephen King project. That's a very good point, Temple. King probably did ruin the party clown for hire business. Although, to be fair, I think John Wayne Gacy probably contributed to that, but I digress. Stephen King is an interesting writer, and he was a very strong influence for me at a time when I was very receptive to what he was saying, which of course is horror, it's dark, it's gory, it's it's scary. It's something any teenager would latch onto because it's kind of different. It's a little taboo. You shouldn't be reading something by Stephen King because it might give you nightmares. Um, and sure enough, he did. But whatever. Um, but I read a lot of his stuff, and he did write a fantasy series called The Dark Tower, which is very bizarre, very surreal. Um, if you have never, if you can get into it, by all means, do so. I can't say that it ends well or that it wraps things up nicely, but it's an interesting yarn nonetheless. Um, so that's Stephen King. A couple other writers who I couldn't get to, but who I felt deserve honorable mentions are, of course, George R. R. Martin for Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones. Uh, it is a he's a really he he has a great attention to detail. Like there is very little in his books that is left to the imagination, even though sometimes I wish it had been. There are descriptions where I have there even at 36 I'm reading it and I feel like, should I be reading this? This doesn't feel right to me. And then another one, a fantasy author who I really like, who never quite got his due, unfortunately, um, is this man, David Eddings. Um, he wrote two big series. The first one is called The Belgariad, and the second one is called The Malloreon, and they're both two series in the same universe. Um, and it's a very imaginative fantasy series that I wouldn't say is unfilmable. Like, it could probably be made into a very good miniseries. It just never has been. Um, but a lot of his characters I felt were they're very human. Um, and they're very cool characters. And you really, I felt more empathy for the characters in this series than I did for most other things I've read. Um, and so I would, if you have never read David Eddings, I do recommend checking out at least try the first book of the Belgariad. If that appeals to you, it's this one is called Pawn of Prophecy. Um, I I recommend him very highly. And so that kind of brings us to the end. We've gone a little over time, but oh well. Um, thank you all for participating. I see we're on the Game of Thrones discussion now, which of course I have read all 5 books, so I feel I can only talk about 3 of them. At least I can only talk about 3 of them in mixed company. Anything else, and I have to talk to I have to ask, have you read the books? Because if you haven't, there are certain things you don't want to hear from me. So thank you all again for another episode of Torn Book Club. As I said, next week, since this list of authors was all men, next week I want to do a show about female authors and their influence. And there's a huge list to choose from, so please go to our Facebook page. Let me bring that up real quick. Yeah, here we go. Please go to the Facebook page. or tweet us. Our Facebook is facebook.com/tornbookclub, or we're on Twitter at Torn Book Club. Temple, yes, please come up with lists of influential female authors that you love. I know I have a list as well that I would love to dive into, but I'm sure there are plenty of others who I haven't read. And you can email me at Saruman with 2 N's at TheOneRing.net. Ustreamer31, if you are still there, that's my email address. Please email me your some stuff about your book. I'd love to learn more about it. So yeah. So thank you, everybody. Remember, let's just recap real quick here. Remember, National Novel Writing Month is still going on. NaNoWriMo. So if you're doing that, please keep at it. Good luck to you if you're doing it. And also, be sure to check out Middle Earth Envisioned by Brian J. Robb and Paul Simpson. I think you will really like it, especially if you're a fan of Middle Earth and the different interpretations of it. And I'll post a link to that on the Facebook page and on Twitter. And also, Darkling by K.M. Rice is our book of the month. And it is now available in print, and I will post a link to that on Facebook and Twitter as well. And finally, our Rewrite Tolkien contest for November is The Hobbit in the style of J.K. Rowling. If you feel so inclined, please enter. We'd love to hear from you. And that's about it. I will put this I will put the information for the show up one last time and sign off. And thank you all again, and I will see you next week.